The road was burning at 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Three tiny golden puppies curled together in the middle of the highway, crying for their mom. Drivers swerved around them. Then, a quiet stranger stepped into traffic. No one knew his name, but what he carried away in his arms moments later touched every heart that heard the story. Midday in California was when the world seemed to boil. The sky was stripped of softness, a white-blue glare so bright it made the eyes water. The air rippled above the highway, every shimmer a knife of heat. On this day, the asphalt surface temperature had climbed to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The smell of hot tar and engine fumes mixed into a heavy blanket that clung to the lungs. Caleb Moore pushed his cart along the shoulder, one crooked wheel shrieking with each turn. At 48, he was a man shaped by work that broke the body without lifting it out of poverty. Tall but slightly hunched, he carried the years in the slope of his shoulders and the uneven bend of his spine. His skin was darkened by decades in the sun, his jawline rough with wiry stubble that caught the light. Gray streaked his short hair, and his hazel eyes, kind when they dared to be, mostly stayed downcast. He had learned early that looking up meant being seen, and being seen invited trouble. As a boy, his stutter had marked him for ridicule. Classmates would mimic him until tears welled in his eyes. Supervisors on construction sites sighed and cut him off mid-sentence. Even strangers at the grocery store, impatient for him to finish speaking, would glance at one another and smirk. Over time, Caleb had taught himself to say less. Silence was safer. His life now was stripped to the bare essentials. A single-room trailer near the back of a dusty lot, a battered cart for collecting cans and scrap, and a daily rhythm of moving from one empty place to the next. Every dollar was counted twice. Rice and beans most nights, with the occasional dented can of fruit if the week had been good. The sun pressed on his back like a weight as he walked, sweat soaking the collar of his faded shirt. The hiss of tires on hot pavement was constant, until something else rose above it. A small, thin sound. Caleb slowed, head tilting. The sound came again. A high-pitched whimper, uneven, almost swallowed by the heat. Far ahead, the shimmer of the road wavered like water. In it, shapes began to emerge. Three golden retriever puppies, so young their legs were still unsure beneath them, lay in the outer lane. Their fur, dulled from dust and grime, clung in clumps to their bodies. Tiny ribs lifted and fell with shallow breaths. One pup tried to stand. Its paws pressed onto the road's blistering surface, and it yelped, stumbling sideways. It collapsed, panting, its small mouth open, tongue dry and swollen. Another lay still for long moments, before shivering and dragging itself a few inches toward a scrap of shade that didn't exist. The smallest hadn't moved at all, except for the slow rise of its chest. The heat was a predator here. The blacktop radiated upward, cooking from below, while the sun beat down without mercy from above. The air itself was an enemy, stealing moisture from every breath, pulling strength from every muscle. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He'd seen animals in trouble before. A stray cat stiff and lifeless behind a dumpster. A bird lying still on the sidewalk after the sun had had its way. He knew the signs. These pups didn't have much time. For a moment, he took a step forward. But the thought hit him hard. What could he do? He had no food for them, no money for a vet, no space in his already suffocating trailer. Even keeping himself alive some weeks felt like a losing game. The traffic roared by. Across the way, two young men stood in the narrow shade of a chain-link fence, sipping from cans. One of them looked toward Caleb, then toward the dogs, and grinned. Caleb didn't need to hear their words. He recognized the sound of laughter at his expense. He turned his gaze back to the road ahead. He could keep walking. He should keep walking. Someone else, someone with a car, with money, could stop and help. Behind him, one of the pups gave a soft, broken cry. The smallest's head shifted weakly, as though searching for the sound of footsteps that might mean rescue. The heat pressed harder, as if urging him to move, to leave this behind. Caleb gripped the handle of his cart, the metal nearly hot enough to burn through his thin gloves. He set his shoulders and took a step forward. Then another. He didn't look back. On the road behind him, the three small bodies lay scattered like forgotten toys, the shimmer of the air around them making them look almost unreal. Their fur caught the light in dull flashes of gold. One lifted its head for the last time that hour, then let it fall again. Caleb kept walking, his shadow stretching long in the noon sun, each squeak of the cart's wheel pulling him farther from the cries he tried not to hear. The noise of the highway followed Caleb like an echo he couldn't shake. He had walked nearly half a mile since he'd turned his back on the three puppies, the squeak of his cart wheel grinding into his ears with each step. The midday heat pressed harder with every yard, pulling sweat from his skin in steady streams. His shirt clung damply to his back, and the metal handle of the cart burned against his palms even through the thin gloves. He tried to focus on the ground ahead, but his mind kept sliding back to the image of them. The smallest lying almost still, the others shifting weakly in the molten air. Caleb swallowed, but the dryness in his throat made the motion rough. They were just animals, he told himself. And he was just a man who could barely keep his own life stitched together, yet the thought didn't hold. He knew what being left behind felt like. He knew the weight of watching the world pass without anyone stopping to help. A horn blared somewhere behind him. Caleb's head turned automatically, his gaze sweeping over the traffic, and then catching on the shimmer in the distance. Three small shapes, barely visible against the road's brightness. One of them moved its head, an unsteady, almost hopeless motion. He stopped walking. The air felt heavier now, the smell of tar sharper. His chest tightened. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. He left the cart where it was, angled off the shoulder toward a gap in the barrier. Heat roared up from the pavement as soon as he stepped closer, the ground almost vibrating under the constant pressure of the passing cars. A woman in a silver sedan passed, her face visible for an instant. Dark hair pulled into a tight bun, sunglasses reflecting the road, lips pressed together in mild annoyance as she glanced at him. Caleb didn't know her name, and she didn't slow down. He waited for a break, heart pounding in his ears. The sun was blinding here, bouncing off hoods and windshields. Then he moved, crossing the first lane in a few long strides. The heat felt alive against his legs, crawling upward. The first puppy lay closest. Its small, grimy body trembled as he bent and lifted it. Its fur was rough, tangling under his fingers, and its paws radiated heat from the burned pads. Caleb pulled it against his chest, shielding it from the sun as much as he could. Back at the shoulder, he set it down gently on the dusty gravel, then turned without hesitation for the next. The second pup whined faintly when he scooped it up, its breathing fast and shallow. Caleb could feel its heartbeat fluttering against his forearm, a fragile pulse that made him move faster. The last one was the smallest and farthest from the shoulder, curled tightly with its head tucked in. When Caleb touched it, it didn't react at first, and panic jolted through him. Then, a faint shiver passed through its body, and he exhaled, gripping it more carefully than the others. By the time he reached the shoulder again, his shirt was plastered to him, and his vision wavered in the glare. He crouched beside them, breath uneven, and reached into his cart for his dented canteen. The water inside was warm and tasted faintly of rust, but it was all he had. He unscrewed the cap and poured a little into the plastic lid. Holding it under the muzzle of the first pup, he waited until the small pink tongue flicked out. One drank, then the others, each taking turns. The smallest could only manage a few laps before lowering its head again. As they drank, a shadow fell across him. Caleb looked up to see a man in his 30s standing a few feet away. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a deep tan and a short beard, wearing a fluorescent orange safety vest over a sweat-darkened t-shirt. His work boots were scuffed, and the look in his dark eyes was more curious than hostile. "You crossing the highway for them?" the man asked. His voice carried over the traffic, steady and even. Caleb nodded, clearing his throat before answering. Yeah." The man's gaze shifted to the puppies, then back to Caleb. "Could have been worse," he said. "You move fast." Without another word, he walked away toward a parked maintenance truck further down the shoulder. Caleb focused back on the pups. Their breathing was steadier now, though they still looked exhausted. He tugged off his own faded overshirt and spread it over them for shade, leaving himself in a sweat-soaked undershirt. The traffic thundered on, indifferent to the rescue happening a few feet away. Caleb sat back, knees aching, and studied the small creatures now huddled together. They had no idea who he was. They would not know how close they'd come to being left behind entirely. For the first time in a long while, Caleb felt something more than just survival's dull pull. It was a spark, small but stubborn. The walk back from the highway was slower than Caleb expected. The midday heat had not eased, If anything, it clung more heavily now, as though the sun had settled its full weight on his shoulders. He had draped his faded overshirt over the 3 golden retriever puppies in the cart, tucking the edges to keep the glare off their small faces. Their bodies were pressed together, breathing shallow but steadier than before. Every few steps he glanced down at them, watching for the tiny rise and fall of their chests. By the time he reached the outskirts of the neighborhood where he rented his place, the streets were quieter. Here, the cracked asphalt was broken up by narrow strips of dry grass and the occasional patch of shade from a leaning telephone pole. A young boy on a rusted bike coasted past, glancing at the cart but not stopping. The sound of the bike chain faded quickly into the hum of cicadas. Caleb's home sat at the far end of a short, dusty lane, a squat, single-room structure with corrugated tin roofing and paint long since peeled to reveal the gray wood beneath. The door stuck slightly when he pulled it open, the frame warped from years of heat and winter damp. The moment he stepped inside, the difference in temperature was only barely noticeable. The tin roof trapped warmth like an oven, and the air was thick and still. He set the cart just inside and lifted the puppies out one by one. Up close, their condition was clearer. The largest, with a faint white streak across its forehead, was already lifting its head more, eyes darting toward the dim corners of the room. The second, a slightly smaller one with darker golden fur, wobbled when it tried to stand, but managed a slow circle before lying back down. The smallest remained curled tightly, its fur dull and clinging in uneven tufts, eyes half-lidded. Caleb fetched an old wool blanket from the corner, a faded, fraying thing that had been with him since his first construction job years ago. He folded it into a rough nest in a shallow cardboard box, placing it near the wall, where a small gap under the door might let in a breath of cooler air. From the single-burner hot plate in the corner, he set water to boil in a dented saucepan, then stirred in a handful of cheap rice. The scent of starch filled the room as he mashed the cooked grains into a thin porridge, adding a splash of the powdered milk he'd bought months ago. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He spooned a little of the mixture into a shallow saucer and placed it near the puppies. The largest leaned forward almost immediately, lapping clumsily, spilling as much as it swallowed. The darker furred pup followed suit, eating in slow, deliberate mouthfuls. The smallest did not move. Caleb dipped a finger into the porridge and touched it lightly to the pup's mouth. It shivered, eyes fluttering but not opening fully. A faint knock came at the open doorway. Caleb looked up to see Mrs. Halpern, his nearest neighbor, peering inside. She was a woman in her 60s, with short, tightly curled white hair and a frame that seemed both slight and unyielding. Her sun-spotted hands rested on the handle of a plastic laundry basket balanced against her hip. "You got dogs now?" she asked, her voice more curious than accusing. Caleb cleared his throat. "Found them on the highway." Her gaze dropped to the smallest pup. "That one don't look so good," she said bluntly. Then, softer, "You'll need to watch it tonight." She didn't step inside, but her eyes lingered on the scene a moment longer before she nodded once and continued down the lane, her laundry basket swinging at her side. Caleb returned his attention to the weak pup. Kneeling, he whispered, "Come on, little one," his voice catching on the first word. He tried again with the porridge, holding the tip of his finger just under its nose. After a long moment, the tiny tongue flicked out, taking only the smallest taste before retreating again. The hours that followed were quiet. The tin roof popped occasionally as the sun shifted, and a breeze rattled the thin walls. The largest pup curled beside the darker furred one, their sides rising and falling in unison, the sound of their breathing a small comfort in the stillness. The smallest lay apart, and Caleb found himself glancing over at it more often than he realized. When evening came, the light slanted low through the dusty window pane, painting the inside of the room in gold. Caleb sat on the edge of his narrow cot, hands clasped, elbows resting on his knees. He wasn't a man given to speaking much, even to himself, but now he bent his head and murmured a prayer, words halting but steady in meaning. He prayed for strength, for the small life lying in the blanket box, and for the chance to keep them safe a little longer. The air cooled slightly as the sun dipped, but the warmth inside lingered. Caleb rose, checked once more on the pups, and pulled the blanket gently over the smallest one's body. Its breathing was faint, but still there. In the quiet, he let the weight of the day settle. Heat, traffic, danger, and the unexpected responsibility now sleeping on his floor. The first few days passed without incident, though Caleb never let the puppies out of his sight for long. He fed them small portions often, keeping a bowl of water within reach of the makeshift box bed. The largest and the middle pup had begun to explore the edges of the room, stumbling on unsteady legs, sniffing at the worn furniture. The smallest still lay apart, gathering strength slowly. Caleb slept lightly, waking at the faintest sound. By the fourth night, the heat had lifted slightly, but the air was still heavy. The neighborhood was quiet in that uneasy way small places get after dark. Only the chirp of crickets and the distant hum of a highway far enough away to sound like the ocean. Caleb sat on the edge of his cot, mending a tear in his only decent work shirt by the dim light of a desk lamp. The puppies were huddled together on the blanket, their breathing soft and even. A sudden metallic scrape broke the stillness. It came from outside, near the side of the house, where the fence leaned inward. Caleb froze, needle halfway through the fabric, and listened. Another sound, a soft crunch of gravel. He moved quietly to the single small window. The glass was cloudy, the frame slightly warped, but he could make out the shape of a man standing just beyond the fence line. The figure was tall and broad, wearing a hooded sweatshirt despite the warm night. His hands rested on the top of the chain link, head tilted toward the house in a way that made Caleb's skin tighten. A faint glint caught in the light, eyes reflecting back, unblinking. Caleb's breath came slower now, controlled. He didn't move the curtain, not wanting to draw more attention. He had heard whispers before, half-joking remarks in the corner store about guys who know how to make quick money off a good dog. It was no secret that some in this neighborhood trapped strays and even stole pets, selling them to buyers who didn't ask questions. The man outside didn't move for several seconds, then turned his head as if scanning the street. Without warning, a shadow flickered in the periphery. A second figure, shorter, moving quietly behind him. This one bent to pick up something from the ground. Caleb couldn't see what it was, but the way the man's arm drew back told him it was no friendly gesture. A sharp thud hit the side of the house, followed by a muffled yelp from inside. Caleb spun, heart pounding. The middle puppy had stumbled back from the box, whimpering. A dark mark was already forming along its side, the fur ruffled where the impact had struck. He crouched, checking quickly. No bones felt broken, but the pup flinched when he touched the bruise. Rage swelled inside him, hot, tight, but he forced it down. He knew his voice could betray him. The stutter would catch, slow him down, and he would not risk sounding weak in front of men like that. Instead, he moved quickly to the front door, locking it. He dragged his small chest of drawers against it for good measure, then checked the back window latches. The man's footsteps outside retreated slowly, gravel crunching under deliberate steps. Caleb stayed at the window until the shapes vanished into the shadows at the far end of the street. Later, as the night deepened, he sat with the bruised puppy curled in his lap, its breathing returning to normal. He rubbed its head gently, murmuring words that came haltingly, but carried all the steadiness he had. You're safe here. But as he lay back down, sleep came in restless bursts. In the darkness, the memory of those unblinking eyes at the fence lingered like a cold draft through the walls. The morning after the long, tense night, Caleb moved slowly, his body still carrying the tautness of a man who'd slept in fragments. The smallest pup had stayed close to the others, and the bruised one was eating again, though gingerly. Caleb made a note to check the injury later, but for now, he needed to fetch water from the communal tap down the lane. As he stepped out, a familiar voice called from the far end of the street. "Caleb!" The tone was warm but commanding. He turned to see Reverend Thomas Hale walking toward him, the man's stride brisk despite the rising heat. Thomas was in his mid-60s, tall and broad in the shoulders, with a presence that seemed to fill the space around him. His neatly combed silver hair caught the light, and the lines at the corners of his deep-set brown eyes spoke of years spent both smiling and frowning at the people he served. His skin, tanned and weathered, bore the marks of a life spent outdoors in service and labor alongside his congregation. The dark suit coat he wore was open over a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up past the forearms. "I heard from Mrs. Halpern you've taken in some dogs," Thomas said as he came to a stop in front of Caleb. His voice carried the steady cadence of a man used to speaking to crowds, but his gaze was direct and personal. Caleb shifted his weight, gripping the water jug in his hand. "Found them on the highway?" he replied, his words halting but clear enough. Thomas's brows knit, 3 puppies in this heat? That's not a small thing, Caleb. He placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder, a solid, grounding gesture. Let's have a look at them. Inside, Thomas crouched by the cardboard box where the puppies were resting. The largest, curious, sniffed at his outstretched hand, while the darker one wagged its tail tentatively. The smallest stayed pressed against the blanket. They need to see a vet, Thomas said firmly as he stood. I'll drive you. I know Dr. Carden. She owes me a favor or two. Dr. Evelyn Carden's clinic sat at the edge of the town, a low building with a blue awning that provided shade to the small porch out front. She was a woman in her 40s, of medium height, with chestnut brown hair pulled into a practical braid. Her pale skin had the faint flush of someone who spent long hours inside, but her green eyes were quick and attentive. Evelyn moved with the efficient calm of someone who had seen most things that could go wrong with animals and still believed in fixing what she could. She examined each puppy in turn, speaking in a steady, reassuring voice. Dehydrated, mild burns on the paw pads, and this one, she touched the bruised pup gently, will be sore for a while, but nothing's broken. She handed Caleb a small bag of ointment and another of special feed, explaining how to use each. At the counter, Thomas settled the bill with a simple wave of his hand, ignoring Caleb's quiet protest. This is not charity, the Reverend said as they stepped back into the sunlight. It's the community looking after its own. By Sunday, Thomas had shared the story with his congregation. The church, a modest white building with a single steeple, was filled with the low hum of voices and the faint smell of coffee from the fellowship hall. Thomas spoke of the rescue, of Caleb's willingness to step into danger, and of the needs the puppies still had. His words carried, not as a plea, but as an invitation. After the service, people came forward. Mrs. Dyer, a middle-aged woman with soft brown eyes and a crown of graying curls, offered an old dog bed her late spaniel had used. A young man named Luke, lanky with a shy smile, brought over a small bag of dry food. Even Mrs. Halpern appeared, holding out a dish towel she said was good for wrapping little ones. In the days that followed, something in the neighborhood shifted. Caleb, who had long kept his gaze low when walking down the lane, now found himself greeted. A man in a baseball cap raised a hand in silent acknowledgement as Caleb passed. A woman watering her garden smiled and nodded toward the pups in his arms. One afternoon, he took them for a slow walk to the patch of grass by the corner store. The smallest still needed to be carried most of the way, but the other 2 wobbled along on their own. A cluster of children appeared, their laughter spilling into the street as they knelt to pet the puppies. Little fingers stroked soft ears, and 3 tiny tails wagged with a rhythm that felt like joy. Caleb stood back, watching. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, but his lips curved into something he hadn't worn in a long while, a smile that stayed even when he looked away. The sun was directly overhead when Caleb tightened the strap of his work gloves and hefted another length of timber onto his shoulder. He was working at a small construction site on the far side of the neighborhood, a modest home renovation job where he'd been hired to haul and stack supplies. The pay was minimal, but steady work had been rare lately, and the weight on his shoulders felt lighter when he knew he could buy more food for the pups. The site foreman, Greg Fulton, stood near the tool shed, wiping his brow with a faded red bandana. Greg was in his 50s, barrel-chested, with thick forearms browned by decades in the sun. His face was square and weathered, framed by a salt and pepper beard that did little to hide the deep creases at the corners of his mouth. Though his voice was rough, he treated his crew fairly, having once been a laborer himself before saving enough to start small contracting jobs. Caleb had just stacked the timber neatly when he caught a faint, acrid smell. At first he thought it was from the nearby asphalt road baking in the 140 degrees Fahrenheit midday heat, but then he saw it. Thin gray smoke curling upward over the rooftops in the direction of his lane. His chest tightened instantly. He dropped the gloves, took 2 steps toward the street, then broke into a run. Greg called after him, "Caleb, where are you going?" But the words faded under the pounding of Caleb's feet on the hot pavement. The closer he got, the thicker the smoke became. By the time he turned onto his lane, the sight was a punch to the gut. Black smoke billowing from the warped tin roof of his house. Flames licking upward from a broken window. The air shimmered with heat, and the scent of burning wood and melted plastic hung heavy. Without thinking, Caleb charged forward. He could feel the scalding heat radiating from the ground through his boots. the midday sun merging with the fire's own heat to turn the air into something that clawed at his lungs. The front door was partially ajar. He shoved it open and was immediately met with a wave of hot, smoke-filled air that made him cough violently. Somewhere through the haze, he heard them, high-pitched, frantic whines. He pushed inside, keeping low. The room was choked with smoke, the thin curtains above the cot already singed. In the far corner, the three puppies huddled together, eyes wide, fur flecked with ash. The smallest was pressed flat against the wall, trembling. Caleb scooped up the two larger pups first, cradling them against his chest as he stumbled toward the door. Outside, he set them down in a patch of dirt away from the flames, then turned back without pause. His lungs burned, vision blurring, but the thought of leaving the smallest behind was unbearable. Inside, the heat was worse now, a living thing pressing down from all sides. He reached the last pup and pulled it close, feeling its tiny heart hammering against his arm. As he turned, part of the tin roof groaned above, a section of it collapsing inward. Caleb ducked, shielding the puppy as sparks showered the floorboards. He emerged into the blinding sunlight coughing hard, his throat raw from the smoke. Greg had arrived, along with a neighbor, Danny Lopez, a wiry man in his early 40s with close-cropped black hair and a perpetual squint. Danny worked odd jobs around the area and was known for his quick reflexes in emergencies. He grabbed a bucket from his truck and began throwing water on the nearest flames, while Greg shouted into his phone for the fire department. Caleb knelt in the dirt, pulling the three puppies close. Their fur was warm but unburned, their eyes blinking rapidly in the harsh light. He ran a hand over each, checking for burns or cuts, relief washing over him as he found none. His own shirt was damp with sweat and smoke, his arms streaked with soot. The fire truck's siren wailed in the distance. Greg clapped a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "You got them out. That's what matters." Caleb managed a small, smoke-roughened smile, glancing down at the puppies now nestled together again. The house was damaged, maybe beyond easy repair, but in that moment, the only thing that mattered was the steady rise and fall of three small chests. The fire was out by late afternoon, leaving Caleb's small home blackened and warped, the acrid scent of smoke still hanging in the air. He had moved the three puppies into a temporary shelter in Greg's storage shed for the night, laying the familiar old blanket on the floor and placing their food and water close. Their fur still held faint traces of ash, but their eyes were bright, and their tails flicked whenever he knelt beside them. The following morning, Caleb was sweeping away debris from the doorway when a young woman appeared at the end of the lane, walking with quick, determined steps. She carried a small camera in one hand, her other hand gripping a tote bag slung over her shoulder. She was in her late 20s, with sun-kissed skin, shoulder-length auburn hair tied into a messy ponytail, and a pair of square-framed glasses slipping down the bridge of her nose. Her name was Lauren Perez, a volunteer with the local animal rescue network. "I'm looking for Caleb Moore," she said, her voice carrying a mix of curiosity and urgency. Caleb straightened, brushing soot from his hands. That's me." Lauren's gaze softened as she glanced past him at the puppies, now curled up in the shade of the shed's doorway. "I heard what happened yesterday. Greg told me. Do you mind if I film a little? People should see this." She crouched low, letting the camera focus on Caleb as he gently lifted each pup, holding them close. Her voice prompted him with simple questions. How he found them, how he got them out during the fire, and he answered haltingly but without shame. When she was done, she smiled. "Thank you for letting me share this. It matters." By evening, the short video was online. Lauren's post read, "This is Caleb, a man from our community who risked his life to save 3 abandoned puppies from both the highway and a house fire. He doesn't ask for help, but he deserves it." Within hours, the post spread beyond their small town, shared across California by strangers who added words like hero and guardian. The next day, 2 vans pulled into the lane. From the first stepped a middle-aged woman with neatly pinned blonde hair and a crisp navy blouse tucked into khaki trousers. Her name was Patricia Lang, regional coordinator for West Coast Animal Welfare. Patricia's handshake was firm, her blue eyes sharp but kind as she introduced herself. "We'd like to help, Mr. Moore. Lauren told us everything." Her team unloaded bags of premium dog food, boxes of medical supplies, and soft bedding. Another volunteer, a tall man with a narrow face and dark beard named Amir, took measurements of the house and walked the property with Greg, discussing repairs. Within a week, the charred tin roof was replaced, the warped door frame fixed, and the inside walls scrubbed and repainted. The animal welfare team even added a small fenced pen beside the house, where the puppies could play safely. Caleb watched all this with a quiet awe he struggled to put into words. The neighbors noticed too. People who once avoided eye contact now nodded or waved as they passed. An elderly man from 3 houses down left a bag of dog treats on the step without knocking. One evening, Caleb returned from fetching water to find a small pile near his door, 2 cans of soup, a chew toy shaped like a bone, and a folded note with no signature that simply read, "For you and your friends." It wasn't only material things that changed. When Caleb walked the puppies down the lane now, heads turned for a different reason. Children called out greetings, and adults stopped to ask about their health. Even Mrs. Halpern, who once spoke in clipped sentences, leaned over her fence to say, "They're looking stronger every day." Caleb didn't know if he liked the attention, but he knew one thing for certain. The 3 small lives he had carried from smoke and flame had brought something unexpected back into his own life, a sense that he was no longer entirely invisible. By late August, the air in the neighborhood had shifted from the heavy scorch of high summer to something gentler, though the California sun still cast its warm weight over the rooftops. Caleb's home no longer stood blackened and broken. The new tin roof gleamed softly in the light, the freshly painted walls holding the brightness without heat. Inside, the patched floorboards no longer creaked with every step, and a faint scent of cedar lingered from the work the volunteers had done. The fenced pen beside the house had quickly become the puppies' favorite place. They were nearly unrecognizable from the trembling, dust-covered creatures Caleb had first found on the highway. The largest, with its pale golden coat and white streak across the forehead, bounded ahead of the others with endless energy. The middle one, a richer, darker gold, had a playful habit of circling back to nip at its siblings' ears before darting away. The smallest, still just a bit more cautious, had filled out into a healthy, bright-eyed companion, its fur now soft and evenly brushed. Together they darted through the grass, the sound of their small paws tapping against the earth, mixing with the distant hum of cicadas. Caleb sat under the wide shade of the old pepper tree near the edge of the yard. Its branches, heavy with feathery leaves, cast shifting patterns of shadow across his face and the worn cover of the Bible resting in his lap. His posture was easier now. His shoulders no longer carried that perpetual inward hunch, and when neighbors passed by on the lane, he looked up and met their eyes. That afternoon, Mrs. Halpern came by, carrying a plate covered in foil. She wore her usual wide-brimmed straw hat and a sleeveless blouse printed with faded flowers. "Brought you some peach cobbler," she said simply, setting the plate on the table beside him. Her eyes lingered on the puppies, now chasing a bright red ball one of the neighborhood children had left. "They've grown," she added, and there was no hint of the sharpness her voice used to hold. Later, a boy named Tyler, no more than 8, with sun-bleached hair and a smudge of dirt across his nose, appeared at the fence with a small wicker basket. Inside were scraps of fabric, neatly folded. "My grandma said you can use these for blankets for the dogs," he explained, his voice careful, as though unsure if he was welcome. Caleb smiled, the expression reaching his eyes. Thank you, Tyler." The boy grinned and raced off down the lane. From the street, Lauren Perez waved as she passed, her camera slung across her body. She had been by twice that week, checking in and taking new footage for the rescue group's newsletter. "They'll want to see the happy ending," she'd said with a wink. As the sun dipped lower, Caleb leaned back in his chair, watching the puppies settle into a heap near the pepper tree. The smallest yawned, its pink tongue curling before it tucked its head under the larger pup's chin. The warm air carried the scent of dry grass and the faint sweetness of the peach cobbler cooling on the table. He opened the Bible and read a familiar passage, the words steady on his lips. He thought of the highway, the fire, the faces of strangers who had stepped forward to help, and of the 3 golden shapes now dozing in the shade. The change in his life hadn't come in a sudden bolt from the sky. It had arrived on small, unsteady legs, with quiet eyes that had asked for nothing more than water, safety, and kindness. When he closed the book, Caleb didn't bow his head out of habit or shame. He looked straight ahead, the late summer light warming his face. In his heart, he felt the answer to prayers he hadn't known how to speak. Not a distant miracle, but a tangible one, right here in the soft rise and fall of 3 small chests beside him. Sometimes, God's miracles don't arrive as thunder from the sky. They come on four small paws, with eyes that ask for nothing but love. In Caleb's life, 3 abandoned puppies became the answer to prayers he never knew how to speak, reminding him and us that kindness can turn the smallest rescue into the greatest change. In your everyday life, you may be the miracle someone else is praying for. Never underestimate the power of a simple act, a gentle word, or a helping hand. If this story touched your heart, share it so others can feel the same warmth. Comment below where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of hope. And may God bless you, your family, and all the living souls He places in your path.